Hi, I'm Dale Sherbeck, and welcome to the HQ, a CHA Learning and Healthcare Can podcast serial where we dive into healthcare issues and topics from the perspective of its people and discuss them with those that are leading in the health system. Together, we'll try to unpack these topics and learn what actions are being taken to innovatively solve them today. There's nothing really novel about engaging a business's stakeholders in developing products and services. It's not only core to marketing, but it's also core to product development. Most of us have seen or even participated in advisories, focus groups, beta testing, surveys, and many other tactics that elicit our opinions and input as customers and consumers. It's best practice and it makes good sense. Even Hollywood does it. And yet, in healthcare, one of the largest sectors in our economy and life, a sector that is in fact all about people, the notion of engaging in stakeholders in our business design and delivery is in fact still relatively new. In fact, many would say it's still at the level of social movement, and if it is widespread, it's not very deep nor consistently valued. As I can attest through our own work at CHA Learning and Healthcare Can, it is essential to our health system performance and improvement that healthcare writ large, by which I mean organizations, teams, and leaders, partner with its stakeholders in its work. These stakeholders go by many names that include patients, residents, clients, and families, which is why we ourselves have adopted the language of being people-centered. One area of healthcare that is still grappling with how to engage its stakeholders is that of health research, which has adopted the language of patient-oriented research as a sort of North Star to guide this work. So that is the topic for today's episode, the perspectives and the ins and outs of how healthcare does and needs to partner with patients in undertaking the critical research we depend upon. To discuss this complex topic, I'm joined by three patient partners from three parts of Canada. Firstly, I'm joined by Brenda Andreas. With lived experience as both a patient and a researcher, Brenda focuses her research on bringing connection, community, and relational equity to impact evidence-based practices within the healthcare system. To her, this means building trusting relationships and advocating for the voice and visibility of our vulnerable and underserved populations. Among her many roles, Brenda is currently the co-chair of the Canadian Primary Care Research Network's Patient Council. Brenda has also been a co-principal applicant on the CIHR-funded grants for the CPCRN and served on both its executive and steering committees. Brenda is also an active patient partner within the Saskatchewan Health Authority and serves on several of SHA's board committees and councils. She also partners with Accreditation Canada, USask Behavioral Ethics Board, Healthcare Excellence Canada, and with University of Manitoba College of Nursing. And I would be remiss if I didn't add that she's also an esteemed faculty in our own CHA Learning People-Centered Care Leadership Program. Next, I'm happy to introduce Beth Chavalia. Beth is a physiotherapist who works in quality and risk in a long-term care residence here in Ottawa. Prior to that, she worked in acute care for 18 years. She's the chair of the Ontario Institute of Cancer Research Patient and Family Advisory Council, a patient ambassador with the Canadian Institute for Health Research, and sits as the director for Arnprior Regional Health. A 4-year breast cancer survivor, she's excited about the ongoing cancer discoveries that will not only extend life, but most importantly, support quality of life. And lastly, I'm delighted to be rejoined on the HQ by Bev Pomeroy. For those who haven't heard our previous conversation, Beth introduces herself as a patient public engagement specialist and an uninvited settler person on the shared traditional ancestral unceded territories of the Shunammai territory, known as its colonial name, Gabriel Island in BC. Bev has a particular interest in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and has co-developed a trauma and resiliency-informed practice program for research and evaluation, which is a strengths-based approach to patient-oriented research. Bev landed in patient-oriented research after her daughter, Sophia, passed away in 2017 from a rare, complex chronic condition at the age of 16. They sit on the board of the BC Patient Safety Quality Council Oversight and Advisory Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research Evidence Alliance and the Canadian Association for Health Services and Policy Research. Hi, Brenda, Beth, and Bev, and welcome to the HQ.
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, what a star panel we have here today to have this really important conversation. It's a tremendous privilege to have all three of you join me for this conversation. I know we have a lot of ground to cover, so we might as well just sort of get right to it. So I know I've given a bit of an introduction to each of you for our listeners here, but I'd like to start giving the diversity of your backgrounds and experience to perhaps to have each of you share your story about what's brought you to becoming a patient partner and getting involved in health research specifically. So maybe we can start in the reverse order of my introduction. Start with you, Bev.
Great. Thanks so much, Dale. Yeah, so similar to my introduction, I work in healthcare and I'm a patient public engagement specialist, but really for me, I started getting into patient-oriented research back in 2017, just shortly after my daughter died, actually. And I was just really struggling with how do I navigate both working in healthcare, but also, how do I take our experience as it was and have some impact or influence in pediatric pain management as an example. And so I got an opportunity to start working with the BC Support Unit, which is one of the 11 or 12 support units here across the country, and was really welcomed into that organization to partner to help inform and influence some of their research priorities that they had. And it really was sort of for me trying to find my sense of purpose and my balance, and really trying to find some hope in our experience that we had as a family. And that's really how I got involved in patient-oriented research to begin with. And also being part of the queer community and being non-binary myself, there were a lot of opportunities for me to take that experience and that lens as well. And again, help influence some of the work that BC Support Unit was doing to reach some of those hardly reached communities in the world of patient-oriented research.
Thanks, Bev, and thank you for doing that. Maybe Brenda, can I come back to you next?
Sure. It is a wonderful opportunity, Dale, to be here today with Bev and Beth and to hear and learn and grow from all of their experiences. But I have to start my conversation with saying that I partner with many organizations, and the opinions that I'm discussion pieces I will be participating in today are simply my own. I'd really have to start with how I became what I refer to as the accidental patient partner. And I will preface that also by saying that grief and anger is a very hard pill to swallow. And that is how I got involved in becoming a patient partner. It is when my mother, the face of healthcare in our small, rural, isolated community here in the southwest corner of Saskatchewan, was the face of healthcare in our community. She was the student nurse. She was the nurse. She was the matron. She was the administrator. She became the patient. And in that time, her needs in the healthcare system had many challenges. And so I made a promise to Mom that I would get involved and I was going to fix the healthcare system. Fast forward to 2017, 2018, like Bev, I was invited to a national summit on integrated primary care put on by one of the sport entities here in Saskatoon. And at that time, I was in the conversation in the room, and it really just came to me that they're talking about system flow. So shaking heart, beating so loud and so fast I couldn't hear myself speak, I got up in front of that room full of strangers, and I asked the question, where's the compassion and caring in healthcare? How do we bring humanity back into our healthcare system? That was a watershed moment for me. And from that moment on, I knew that I would continue in my role as a patient partner within the healthcare system, but I would move toward a more, I think at that time I was thinking, meaningful opportunity to find out more, to be curious, to learn more about how to become what I now refer to myself as a research collaborator. And in that journey as a research collaborator, again, I have been given so much privilege and so much opportunity to be involved in as a collaborator on many research projects here at home in the province of Saskatchewan, also with some nationally funded projects, and also in a couple of international projects. So really, I bring all of me to all of those experiences that I have, whether I'm at the research table or whether I'm at the health system table. And what's really important, I think, for me is always about where are the visibility of the voices who are not here? How did they fit into our conversation today? And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Brenda. I appreciate your story and what's brought you here and your passions. And Beth, to you.
Yeah, hi, thanks. So my story goes back to about 4 years ago when I was diagnosed with stage 3, grade 3 breast cancer 2 weeks before my 40th birthday, when party plans were in full swing and never actually came to be. I was kind of a vocal patient. I had lots of opinions and I got along super well with my oncologist. And I think I was sort of winding down with like acute treatment, and he sent me an email, and it was an invitation to apply to be on the Ontario Institute of Cancer Research's first or inaugural Patient and Family Advisory Council.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you for sure, I had no idea what patient-oriented research was. Patient partnering, I didn't know what that was. But I paid attention because he sent it to me. And I certainly knew what a patient and family advisory council was, but I knew that more in relation to hospital work, because obviously that was my experience as a hospital worker. Anyway, so that's kind of where it came from. And like Bev, I was looking for a way to kind of contribute. I think certainly in the breast cancer communities, it's an enthusiastic bunch and there's lots going on, but I didn't feel as called maybe to the walks or to more traditional kind of fundraising awareness things. Mm-hmm. So yeah, when this kind of came to my plate, I thought it was super interesting, and that's how it kind of like started from there.
Thanks, Beth. So yes, I mean, it sounds like all of you have strong voices that you've wanted to contribute, to be advocates in terms of the parts of the system that you've been involved in, whether directly or through your family's experiences. So Brenda, I started the conversation, I guess, in introduction, talking a little bit about people-centered care, more writ large. And it is been a movement, right? I mean, we're certainly years into seeing this happen in different parts of the system. But how would you describe, as much as it's become popular for people to talk about it, what is happening? I mean, what would be your lens on that? Appreciate, again, you're speaking from the perspective of yourself and only yourself. But how would you describe the state of this movement?
I thought about this, and in reflection, I have to reflect, first of all, back on my own self and say that I am also the unexpected patient with more than 6 chronic conditions. I spend almost every week in the healthcare system, either locally or tertiary or in the major center here in Saskatoon. And so I bring that lived experience of what it is to be a patient in the system. And also as a patient partner, I've been given the health literacy around how to very effectively and purposefully engage with patient partners. And as we all know, Accreditation Canada has developed a policy or a work standard, or a health standard around what is people-centered care. And part of my job as a patient surveyor is to go around the country and visit those health systems and look at how they are implementing what is people-centered care. And I have to say that 2 things have enabled people-centered care. One is the health literacy of patients, families, and communities around how they want to manage their own personal health care. And then the requirement of the health system itself to find a way to implement what is people-centered care. And I will say this respectfully, where you live determines how you experience care, and where you live determines how care is delivered to you. Foundational and fundamental to that is, how are we engaging patients and families in what we call people-centered care? Every health system does it differently. Every patient has a different experience of what that looks like. But primarily for me, the healthcare system is still very much driven top down, and we need to find a way to drive it bottom up. That means for me as the patient, I want to be fully engaged, informed, respected, included. I want to feel like I belong in the healthcare system, and that the relational equity, the power imbalance between myself, the provider, and the system can be left at the front door when I enter the institution, and we can think about how can we collaborate together on my care. So has the system changed, improved? Yes, I believe that we're making excellent progress in moving toward just exploring what is people-centered care. And more importantly, we're starting to shift our thinking more toward what does that mean for the provider, for the patient, and for the system? And then what are the resources needed to make that happen? And that's where I balance my role as a patient partner and as a research collaborator to bring my very loud and vocal lived experience to what matters to me.
Thanks, Brenda. I think that provides a really great overview of the current state of things and what what it means for people-centered care means to you and what it would look like. So, if I was to move to you, Bev, more specifically, and sort of ask, what does that look like in the context of research? What is patient-oriented research when we talk about it, and how does it impact clinical care?
Great. Thanks for that, Dale. Yeah, I mean, just quite simply, patient-oriented research is about engaging patients, clients, natural supports, and their families as partners in the research process. So not as subjects of research, as I think traditionally we know, or participants of research, but actually as partners, and sort of reflecting what Brenda was saying, actually collaborators in the research process. And this engagement just really helps ensure that studies and priorities in our healthcare system ideally focus on patient-identified priorities, which we know ultimately leads to better outcomes. It's really about transforming patients, and we see this in a clinical setting too, as sort of a receiver of care, a receiver of services, to really a proactive partner, someone who's influencing and informing the research process. And it could be priorities for research. It could be how we do research. It could be translating the knowledge that we're gaining and garnering from research into practice that actually is better reflective of our care journeys and our experience. I mean, ultimately, anytime, going back to Brenda's comment on, person-centered care and patient-centered care, people-centered care, really it's about trying to provide better care. Who better to shape those priorities than those who are actually receiving that care and are walking on that journey. And here in Canada, we have the Canadian Institute of Health Research, which is our large funding body. It's one of our largest funding bodies for research. And what was sort of happening around the world was this recognition, thankfully, that a lot of the research dollars, like billions of dollars, goes into research a year throughout the world, like globally, but a very small portion of that was actually impacting patients and their families in their healthcare journey and their experience, because they were missing the mark. So just a really quick example. So patients who have arthritis, tons of research, tons of money was going into researching medications to treat arthritis. And while that was seen to be useful and valuable, and people wanted that, when researchers started engaging with that community in particular about what were their research priorities, it turned out that the arthritis community themselves wanted to understand better quality of life sort of treatments. So occupational therapy, physiotherapy, it really turned research a little bit on its head. They've been spending all this money, looking at one type of treatment or care, when really those that were affected by that condition were saying, actually, this is what we would like to learn more about. This is our curiosity of how it can improve our life. And ultimately, when we have patient-oriented research and we're helping to inform and influence those priorities, there's better uptake of those services, because it reflects more our community and those who are sort of going through that experience. So that sort of is patient-oriented research in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think a great example you've given in terms of whether we focus on more curative or pain management, or the coping and the living with a disease or condition. Um, so, Beth, if I could maybe ask you about, from building on what Bev has just been talking about, what enables patients to be involved in health research?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot more now when researchers put in grants or applications to do research. Many times there's actually a required patient partner like requirement. You have to have a patient partner. So I'll share a cute story. I had a researcher reach out to me through a contact with the Canadian Institute of Health Research. And he said, he's filling in his application. I think it was with Canadian Cancer Association and he got to the section that said, "What's your patient partnership plan?" And he told me, he's like, "I didn't know what that meant." But you know what? Then he picked up the phone, he Googled, he reached out to people, and he came to understand. And I'll to say I agreed to partner with him on that research. So I think there's that. I think there's that sort of like force function. If you want to get our money, you have to kind of do it like this, and I think that's good. I think that's a really tangible way to make things happen. I think there's other sort of organizational things going on too, like even with the Ontario Institute of Cancer Research, creating this patient and family advisory council. They didn't have to do that. No one forced them to do that, but they kind of saw that was like a gap for them and, took it upon themselves and put funds and staff and time into that. And I think that's another piece too, right? Like in order to make it worthwhile and to make it function well, it also does have to have some budget and funding. So that sort of has to be set aside in the plan as well. And I am seeing that in my experiences.
Yeah, so I think you raised, some important points about the structures, I guess, that need to be in place to sort of enable that, whether it's a box that needs to be checked, which obviously has its own risks associated with it if
Yeah.
people are just checking boxes. But it can provoke, I guess, curiosity or learning as well, if I think employed appropriately, and forcing people to learn, I guess, about something that they may not have done before, or even budgets. I think, as you're describing, as being an important lever to again forcing those kinds of functions. Is that would be sort of what you've been describing?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And when people bring those sort of positive attitudes, right, and that curiosity, then it goes really well. And the idea too, even that last researcher I spoke with from London, right, he understood after kind of doing his own research that there was going to be a cost incurred. He did have to put a certain amount of money aside in order to bring on a patient partner and what that would look like. And yeah, absolutely, Dale. I'll add one little example too to what Bev was saying earlier. It's sort of about patient-oriented research that's really prevalent in the cancer world, and with cancer drugs specifically, is that a lot of times you'll see the only measurement for success of a cancer drug is prolonging someone's life. And so then they'll say, "Oh, well, this cancer drug is successful. The average patient in this study lived an extra 6 weeks." But then there's no measure of quality of life in there. And for all we know, those 6 weeks, they were bedridden in terrible pain. So just another sort of example to speak to Bev's example there, that's another way that research really needs to move. It's more than just longevity.
Yeah, it's grounding it in ultimately the experience and the outcomes, and that research isn't for research's sake, as it happens so often in some academic circles, right? It is connected back to a person's experience, and whether that's a desired one or not desirable one, I think obviously should be scrutinized and discussed. So maybe coming back to you, Brenda, we have these goals and ambitions and things that we're trying to achieve. In terms of your own experience, what do you think might be getting in the way of our achieving this?
That's a good question, Dale. I hearken back to what Bev had to say, because what she did for me and what she does very well is describes the mechanics of what I call as research. As a collaborator, a research collaborator, I bring my lived experience and I focus on what I bring. And so when we talk about things that get in the way, the first one is those competing priorities. The research process itself is very focused on the research process. And that's an important piece of the whole conversation. But then you over to what Beth had to say about the need for patients to be engaged and be a part of this process, and then thinking about, yes, that's a really important piece. And so you bring the mechanics with the lived experience, but somehow you hit a few potholes. It doesn't always quite seem to go the way that it should. And so I thought about, what does that really mean? And I think about a couple of things. I think about what research is really focused on is follow the money, because researchers, they often get fewer opportunities despite the X number of grants that they've submitted. And it's really focused on their career and the impact of what that can mean for them. So, and then you have the system where we want answers and we want evidence-based best practices. So the barrier is about those competing priorities and how they all can need to have some, understanding of what are those competing priorities and how do we mix them in and achieve all of them within the process. And part of that for me comes from the funders. And we have to really look at the major funders in our country and look at how they provide the grant money. And if you look at it, there's very little opportunity for that upfront work around engagement with patients and families and those vulnerable communities. You can't just walk into a community and say, hey, I'm a researcher, I'm here, and I want to get your opinion. It can take weeks, months, or years to develop relationships, and there's no funding for that. So I would say that's a huge barrier. A second barrier is the health system itself. We're a little bit protective of our environment and what that looks like for us. So when we have our guests come in and want to do patient-oriented research with us, we have a few barriers related to how are we going to work collaboratively? How do we actually get into the system and work with the provider, with the patient, with the system, with the researcher? How do we bring all of those people together with their different agendas and have them work collaboratively? So we really have to do some thinking around what does it mean to actually do what we're referring to now as the learning health system and how that interacts within the system itself. So I would say that really the barriers really are related to the mechanics, related to from the funders and how we need to change that. But also I think the third barrier is our vulnerable populations. And we expect them to come to us. Why would we actually go out into a community and live our own vulnerability for the time that we're there in that community? And it's hard. And I think about the Upstream Lab in Toronto and how impactful is the work that they're doing around actually stepping outside of their comfort zone and going out into that community and considering before they ask, what are they giving back? What if you want something from a community, what are you prepared to give back? And you have to think about what that ask is and what needs to be returned has to come from what matters to that community, to that individual, to that group. We don't consider that enough. And so for me, that's a concern. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very poignant, Brenda. And I think when you describe some of those things, and maybe it's just because of my own vantage point right now, as our organization is going through a strategic planning exercise. When you talk about priorities and what matters and the language that you've been using, I guess the word that keeps coming to mind, maybe which is less business oriented, is values. Right? It's about, so what do we value, right? And what are our values when it comes to doing some of these things? And if we prioritize something else, it's because we probably are putting more value on it, or we value it more. It speaks to ourselves, and I guess intrinsically too, in terms of what we focus on. So does that resonate in terms of, I guess, some of what you've just been describing as well, and maybe looking at through that lens?
Yes. And so really, we're also just talking about enabling environments. How do we build that cultural responsiveness, that safe space where everyone at the table can feel that they're included, that their voice is heard, that their voice is supported to be heard, that their voice is equal. And we can get there. We have to be mindful about the process of how we do that.
Thanks, Brenda. Beth, if I come back to you, why should we be talking about research in the context of healthcare? I mean, it may seem obvious, but I think it's maybe still an important question to sort of maybe just discuss more specifically. And how does it impact the care itself, certainly as a survivor yourself?
Yeah, for sure. No, I think it's a good question. I think before I got involved in this work and world, I really saw research as something really distant from the front line. Like when I was providing care at the bedside and even as a manager, I just thought it was a million miles away. But one line that I love that really resonates with me is the line that research is care. So if you think about, let's just say a clinical trial where they're actually giving a treatment, right, to a group of people, well, that group of people is receiving care. And so, for example, I'm involved in a clinical trial still. I think it's 5 or 10 years. I can't remember. But I'm in the one group that's getting actually less intervention. So the standard of care had always been to get these sort of 7 injections over 3.5 years of time, and to sort of make your bones a bit more dense. In theory, that perhaps that would help to avoid bone metastases or cancer spreading to your bones.
Mm-hmm.
But then it sort of got questioned as well. Do we need that much? And the risks of this drug are things like necrosis of the jaw. So like bone death, of your, so that's not great. Yeah, it's just standard, right? So, and this is actually one that my oncologist was running, and I got sorted into, now I only got 1 treatment. The other group's getting the standard, which is 7. And then Europe, I think they get like 3. But when you think about that, you think about, research is more than just producing papers and data. There's a group of people that hopefully, and maybe not always, but hopefully is benefiting in some way. And then from there, the conversation kind of goes to, well, if that group of people is benefiting, hopefully, that intervention, the money that's coming to the research is funding a lot of that. I didn't know that. So here's an example that I learned. Let's say this trial requires an inpatient stay.
Mm-hmm.
So the person has to stay overnight. They're getting some sort of intervention where this person has to be kept a really close eye on them. Well, the research money has to pay for that person to stay overnight in hospital. I thought that would just be under the umbrella of like, OHIP. I'm in Ontario. OHIP, Ottawa. But no. So I think research continues to sort of stay on the outskirts of healthcare, but it really is an integral part, and it has to be sort of brought in a lot more. So, I've met quite a few research clinicians, so they do a bit of both, and they really understand that world, and they see it because they see it in practice every day. And I think that's a really important thing to understand as a patient and as a healthcare worker, that really what's happening in research is impacting patients right now. And how do we bring research more into the fold so that everyone kind of sees it as equal and worthy?
Yeah, and I think you paint a very vivid picture in terms of, I think that the research is not separate from, right? It is integral or woven into our healthcare delivery, and so certainly deserves, I guess, recognition and respect in terms of that. We've talked a little bit, I think, both of your comments and those of Bev as well, around how patients can drive, I guess, research, or need to be part of driving that research. I guess, how else, I guess, can patients influence this, or what role can they play further, I guess, in driving, I guess, the way health research is done, or what research is being done?
Yeah, I think, ideally, at the beginning, before, like we were chatting about earlier, before that research question is set, then there's conversations with patients. I'm not really sure how often that happens or is able to happen. But I think too, it happens even at the clinical level. Like again, because my experience has been very much with clinical trials, though I will be partnering with a research study that's more like just a lab. That's just like cells, and we'll see what that looks like. But I think it's good to be vocal even at the time. So as an example, at one point I was approached to be a patient, again, a participant, not a partner, but a participant in a certain study. And I said no, because the way it was explained to me made it sound like I was losing out on everything. So I think it's good. And when it was re-explained to me, I actually accepted. But it's good for the patient and important for the patient to be able to say like, hey, I'm not comfortable with this, or like explain this to me in a different way. It doesn't really make sense. What's the benefit? Because ultimately it's okay to say that. Like, you don't have to give and give and give because you're the patient. You feel like you need to give back to the system and everything positive they've done for you. Like speak up, ask your questions, understand what's going on. I think many times we get into this sort of idea, especially if you become a survivor, where you just have to keep giving without any sort of questioning. But I think it's really important to question what's going on and to ask those questions. It'll make everything so much better.
Thanks, Beth. I would just sort of open it up to you, Bev and Brenda, as well, just in terms of your perspectives and that of your families, I guess, in terms of how you might sort of view that question as well. Do you have a different perspective on, I guess, how patients can drive research?
Yeah, I guess I can speak, just a little bit about my experience and coming into patient-oriented research as a partner, as someone who can help, influence the questions, influence the design, what are the priorities, but sort of how it's transitioned over the last year or two, is that patient-oriented research, thankfully, and sort of speaking to what Beth was talking about, there are organizations that are intentionally asking for the public and patients and caregivers to actually put forward their curiosities. And so there are organizations that support my curiosity. So my curiosity, being a bereft parent, and sort of my experience as a caregiver really was around this intersection of trauma and grief. I had a lot of curiosity around that. There wasn't a lot of information. We know healthcare at the point of care is shaped by evidence. Everything you see is everything's evidence informed. Everything's evidence informed. But there weren't a lot of support resources for me in my journey and my experience, because nobody had really had that experience, was actually informing the priorities of research for parents who are bereft, parents who've experienced child loss. And so there was an opportunity for me to put forward my curiosity, which was, what does this intersection of trauma and grief look like? And luckily, I was one of very few projects here in the country who were funded. And so I actually felt so empowered in that moment, and to be able to lead a research project that leaned into my curiosity about my experience that ultimately is going to shape resources and support services for families like myself, which ultimately will have better health outcomes and quality of life as we go on these extraordinary journeys as patients and family members in our particular area of experience. And so that for me is where I've seen a bit of the evolution. So we can influence, and there are now starting to be opportunities. I mean, that was through the Spore Evidence Alliance, and people can still go, you can go as a member of the public, you can go and put forward your curiosity about your experience in healthcare, and you potentially could get funded and completely supported to learn more about that and to ultimately impact your particular area of interest or care or experience. And that for me, I think is really quite extraordinary. That's influence. That to me is true influence in patient-oriented research.
Yeah, I'm actually in the process of that. I guess I'll hear it next month, but I thought that was incredible. And the way that even when they interviewed me to understand my question better and my curiosity, and then sent me back like the whole synopsis of how we talked, and is this clear? Do you want to make any corrections? I was blown away.
This is a really exciting conversation because I need to share a little experience with you that I had last week. I was the first patient ever to be invited to the Department of Family Medicine annual research retreat. I was the only patient in the room, and I said to the researcher who had invited me, do I call a doctor or can I call them by their first name? And I almost didn't get on that elevator to go up to the 9th floor to where the meeting was. And it just so happened that very researcher was coming in out of the parking lot at the same time. And she said to me, come on, Brenda, let's go. So up we went to the 9th floor, and I spent a day and a half with a group of clinicians who are also a combo of being half-time, part-time researcher, faculty, and the other half being a clinician. And for me, just this whole conversation about patient-oriented research really has to be at the point of care, and it has to be inclusive. And watching and being and learning and growing alongside this group of physicians, clinicians, researchers, it was an amazing opportunity for me to see the other side of what that experience. They were more scared than I was, and yet they were equally as curious. And by the end of the day, the last day, 2 of them invited me to be a member of one of their research projects that they're working on. So I think visibility and voice in patient-oriented research, and what we really have to remember is not every research collaborator has the kind of confidence or experience that Bev and Beth and I have. And we were enabled along the way of our journey, I am sure, of becoming those confident individuals who can bring that voice to the table. We acquired it because people cared enough to take the time to support us in learning and feeling our confidence. So I think the same thing could be said for the system and for young or even old researchers or mature researchers who spend a lot of time doing what they do. But training on the job is for everybody, not just the patients. Sorry, Dale.
Nope. Go for it.
Nope, that's it.
Okay. I have a barking dog in the background here. Sorry. But I guess part of what I'm also, taking away from what each of you has shared here is that, I mean, one is that I guess there's a compelling business case, I guess, for curiosity in all of this, right? To want to learn from each other and to engage in, I guess, all parts of the care team, which includes the patients and families in that. But also coming from, I think what you were sharing in particular, Bev, what provoked it for me, which is that there's a holisticness that I think that is required to this too. So it's not just the treatment of the body, right, or the person that's in front of you, that is critical to this. There's all these other psychosocial elements that need to be part of that, and grief and loss and pain and suffering are going to be part of that as well, and should be part of those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, and we can talk about that too. I mean, around how does that patient experience show up? I'm sort of like jumping on one of the things we talked about before, Dale, ahead of time. But
Yeah.
you know, like our health system has a culture. It's paternalistic, it's top down. You know, we've talked about it on a previous podcast, you and I, Dale, talking about, you know, trauma organized systems. Our systems are trauma organized, and there's a personality that shows up in trauma organized systems, which is paternalistic, top down, mandated. You know, they lack feedback loops, communicate, like poor communication. Those cultures can parallel health research because that is the culture of our health system. So it shows up in health research as well. So we do have to be really mindful, and again, enter with curiosity, but enter with compassion and kindness, these relationships, because my experience as an example, and same with Beth and Brenda, they're tenuous. There's a delicacy about our experience. I don't want to say vulnerability because that's sort of coming from a place of deficit maybe or weakness, but you know, there's a sensitivity to our experience that I think we need to be mindful about and understand that even as we're doing patient-oriented research, to do it in a way that's trauma and resiliency informed. And what does that mean? That's That's being aware that we are coming in with trauma or harms. A lot of people go into patient-oriented research because they've been harmed or they've lost a person in their life and they want to make a change and make a shift. So understanding that, having safety and trustworthiness, what does that look like? Opportunities for choice and collaboration. There's all these components of trauma and resiliency informed practice that we can infuse into patient-oriented research as well. Never mind the researchers. I don't want to speak for the researchers, but there's very little research that's actually been done on researchers and their experience and impact of trauma. They're listening to stories that are full of pain and suffering. And so what is their experience in patient-oriented research, and how can we help them as well enter that space in a really well way, so that the research that we're doing is, at the end of the day, going to inform the care that we're receiving at front of line. And so those are some things that I think about when I think of patient experience and patient-oriented research, and sort of these parallels that exist along that way. And to really be sitting in that, again, we talk about curiosity, but with that piece around compassion and kindness, and where does that sit, both in healthcare, in our systems of delivery, but also in patient-oriented research.
Yeah, and I think you're raising the point around compassion. I think is something that's really important for me. I was just at a conference last week that was focusing all about compassion and where that fits within our health system, and that there's obviously to some degree a deficit of it. But I'm curious in terms of the compassion and how it fits within our research, because I can imagine, maybe you can any of you may validate this, that research sometimes may be seen as a little bit more, whether you use the words hierarchical, but is doing too, right? Almost as if you're an object on a laboratory table, right? Which is, as opposed to the suffering with someone, right? The compassion side of things, of being a bit more involved in that. Where do you think compassion fits into what we're talking about patient-oriented research, and is it strong, or is it something that needs more focus? Any of you?
That's a really hard question, Dale. And I would answer it this way. At the end of my day and a half with the Department of Family Medicine, at every conference that you go to or every retreat, it's always about the little survey at the end about what went well, what didn't go well, what would you move forward. And it's when I got up, I was asked to speak at the very end. I said to the group, I don't want you to go home thinking about the outcomes that we were required to achieve here today. I want you to go home and think about the experience of what this day and a half meant to you. How will you take that reflection of what this meant to you personally forward into the work that you do? And of course, they looked at me as if I was coming from Mars, but really, it was very impactful to just say, sometimes it's okay to be human. Sometimes it's okay that when we believe that it is our role and our responsibility to be the caretaker of our patients and families, and we can't give them what they need, to be able to have that very difficult conversation around, I can't help you anymore, or I don't have the resources to give to you to support you in your journey. That is where compassion and caring and humanity comes into healthcare. It's those very difficult conversations. We need to have those same conversations in patient-oriented research, because researchers feel that pressure. I'm sure that they do. That is what I learned just from seeing the view from the other side last week.
Thanks, Brenda.
It makes me think one big thing in cancer researchers are trying to find less invasive ways, not only to treat, but to diagnose, right? So let's say, for even example, instead of like core biopsies, they're talking about just like a blood draw to diagnose even breast cancer. And at first I was super surprised. And as a healthcare worker, I immediately went to, they want to do that because it's cheaper. Because everything else has to be more efficient, it costs less money. And but when you actually talk to them, you realize, well, that's not the only motivation. That they really do want to see less invasive treatments that hurt less, that are less traumatic. And I was surprised by the level of understanding of that. And I found that incredibly helpful, because all those for me were quite traumatic. And then having to repeat them over a few times, I really did. I found that really, really, really rough. And then the other part too, I spoke about to a group of researchers once was, before you do breast cancer surgery, they used to insert a wire into where the tumor was, and you keep the wire in there, and it came out of your body, and then they would take it out. So recently, in the last couple of years, they did a seed placement, so this tiny little seed, and they inject it in. So less invasive, better. Unfortunately, the seed placement didn't work for me, and I ended up needing the wire, and it was pretty horrid. And so when I spoke to this group of researchers, I just reminded them that sometimes the most important work, like I only knew about the wire because the first thing failed, but that's fairly uncommon. So let's say 98% of the breast cancer patients aren't going through what I went through, and that their work may not even be recognized because 98% of the people never knew any different. Like never knew that 5 years ago, everyone was getting a wire shoved in them, like while getting a mammogram and all at the same time. So I have to say that part is very hopeful, and that I feel like that's compassion. Like that's like for time and money is going into things like that. That's super worthwhile. And I guess it's a bonus because it's usually cheaper, but I think that it needs to be balanced with the other positive stuff that comes with it.
And I think too, what Beth, that's just an extraordinary example. I mean, I'd like to think that most people that go into healthcare, even health research, the academics as well, and especially clinicians, they go into healthcare because they want to alleviate suffering. They want to do well. They want to support people. They want to help people. That's really why most people go into that field or that industry. Often it can be sort of educated out of them, right? So we have to think about how are we educating? How are we educating in our healthcare system, in our universities? Are we educating them about patient-oriented research, for one, about, co-PIs, about that process? But the other piece that I think is really important, what we're sort of learning, is that really it starts with self. It's that self-compassion. You can't give what you don't have. And I think we have an incredibly distressed, health force right now. It falls into research, especially if we're thinking of really wanting to encourage clinicians to get into the point of research. But what is that self-compassion? And that also is the same, I would say, for myself in regards to patient-oriented research, and sort of going back to both of you've sort of commented, I've said no to opportunities. And that is a form of self-compassion where we can sit into our, for lack of a better, suffering. We understand that maybe that opportunity isn't a fit for me. Maybe that opportunity, the timing is not right. Maybe I'm having other stressors in my life that are not going to help me, contribute to that patient-oriented research. So really that piece around self-compassion. And I think researchers need to think about that too, is, okay, what does this project mean to me? What do I need to do to take care of myself? If I take care of myself well, then I'm going to be able to take care of others well along the journey. And again, that's not talked about in patient-oriented research. It's starting to be talked about in healthcare, like at the point of service delivery, looking after oneself before I look after somebody else, or in the caregiver journey. But I think we're just starting to learn about what that may or may not look like in patient-oriented research.
Thank you, all of you, for sharing that perspective, and providing some hope. So I think we need certainly a lot more of that. If I can go back to you, Brenda, one of the things that you had mentioned, I think earlier on, and I think it comes up in your intro as well, is you mentioned the discussion about relational equity. Maybe you could describe a little bit about, how that fits in terms of, we've talked a lot about equity, diversity, and inclusion on the HQ podcast. But, where does that fit within, I guess, the context of patient-oriented research, and why do you draw attention to that, Brenda?
I do that because for most patients who are research collaborators, sitting at that table where you don't feel that you are in relational equity is a very challenging place to be. And so I think back to the new grant for the new Canadian Primary Care Research Network, and I think about how not only the patient council was challenged by where do we fit into the governance structure? Where do we fit into the mission, vision, and values of the new network? And where do the researchers and the research projects that we funded under our new grant, how do they sit at that table? And really thinking about, wow, we have to do some mindfulness around what this means for each of us and all of us and how we would get there. And I can't believe that today in this conversation, I haven't talked about building trusting relationships as openly as I should have, because in all things, whether we're in the healthcare system, whether involved in patient-oriented research, we must begin with taking the time to build those relationships. And relational equity is foundational to building those trusting relationships. So for a year and a half, I have struggled with how to support the patient council in their journey into becoming a part of the new network. And the struggle has been really difficult. So what I did to think about actionable outcomes that enable environments that build relationships so that everyone at the table is in right relationship with each other. I harkened back to my experiences here in Saskatchewan, and we started first of all with every meeting begins with reviewing the conversation we initially had around what are our values, what are our principles, what is our charter for working together, how do we deal with those difficult conversations. So we set the values together at our first meeting, and then at every meeting we have a talking circle. And the talking circle begins with a question, any kind of a question. What do you celebrate about the network? What brings you here today? What matters to you today? So at every meeting, our conversation shifts to having we can't start a meeting without the talking circle. And because I live in the treaty lands of the Cree people, the protocols that I use for the ceremony of the talking circle have to do with, first of all, talking circles go and they end when they're done. How long that's going to take is how long it's going to take. But more importantly, what they offer is that opportunity for every voice to be heard at the table and every voice to be respectful and appreciative of the other voices. And you can feel the change in the room when everyone has that opportunity to start the meeting with what matters to you, what is the question, and how do we come together in right relationship in a respectful, authentic, and truthful way. And I tell you that really, when we do get into a difficult conversation, we reflect back on what are our values and what matters to each of us here, and how do we come together, not with an agenda, but we come together to co-create that agenda.
Very powerful. Thank you. And I think, in some ways, a strategy for dealing with some of the things that we've been talking about so far. So, I really appreciate that, Brenda. Thank you. So maybe to any of you as well, and certainly without trying to sort of paint everything with a single brush, because I know that there's a lot of variation and difference in terms of how health research is conducted and people are involved. But in terms of your own, I guess, experiences or within the larger landscape in which you operate, how do you see yourself as true partners in health research consistently, or more part of the research? And I guess part of what I would be, sort of part of what provoked that question for me is, looking at, scientific articles and journals and things like that, where, you've got the list of all the different people who've contributed to the authoring of that. Does your name show up there, right, as a producer of that research? or are you referenced in as a data point in that research itself?
I can jump in there, I guess. I think, here in Canada, we're in stage 2 of patient-oriented research, patient-oriented research 2.0 in Canada. So we've learned, I think, in the last number of years of what that looks like. What does representation look like? What does how we show up? I mean, obviously, I advocate for patient partners to have their name as an author. I advocate for patient partners to get compensation and appreciation for their work. I really believe in advocating patient partners to be part of presentations and to be highlighting the work that we're doing. So all those sorts of things. It's not perfect, but I think at the end of the day, it's about choice. How do you want to be represented? How do you want to be named in papers? How do you want to be highlighted at presentations? So I think there's a variety of different ways we can do that, and we're learning how to do that in a well way. But our academic research world wasn't really prepared for patients submitting, co-authoring papers for publication. So we had to figure that out along the way. We don't really have a lot of ethical frameworks for partnering for research, for patient-oriented research at the front end. So I think these are all things that we're learning. But I think at the end of the day, it comes down to that individual person. I'm sure Beth and Brenda have their own sort of ideas and wants and desires about how their name and their work shows up in patient-oriented research. And I'm sure, obviously, they'll speak to that. But I think we're all in different places on that journey, and we just need to provide choice for people on how they want to show up in that work.
Thanks, Bev.
I think when I first started in this work a little bit, I got a lot of like one-offs, like, hey, can you look at this questionnaire? What do you think? And then I wouldn't necessarily hear back after. And that really didn't sit well with me. There was no offer of compensation and whatever. You sort of end up feeling a little bit, I don't know, used and abused maybe. Like, I want to help, but like, did my input cause any change? Like, what did you end up going with? So I think there's that one piece. And now as I understand, the whole area more, I've kind of delineated more for myself. Like, I only really want to be involved if I'm going to be involved from the beginning. And then if I'm going to be invited to the meetings, and maybe I don't necessarily need to be at all of them, but like, invite me and let me make that decision. And I would like to be invited to the conferences. And if there is opportunity to speak, like, think of me and whatever. So I like how you said it, Bev. It is really giving all the opportunities, because every patient partner is going to have sort of a different comfort level. And I think that even goes to the compensation discussion. Some people don't want it. Some people do want it. Some people, are on, I'm working with one group now where a lot of people are like deep in cancer treatment and are likely on some sort of disability. So maybe, for them, compensation isn't something they're necessarily looking for. But I think it is really individual, and we can't paint every patient partner exactly the same.
That's really interesting, but I hearken back again, Dale, to why you invited Beth and Bev and myself here today. And that is because we are quote unquote leaders. And language around that is we are influencers, we are innovators. And I think that I asked the patient council at our last meeting, do you see yourself as a leader? Or if you don't see yourself as a leader, do you see yourself as a change maker? And it was a very interesting conversation, because each of the members of the Primary Care Research Network Patient Council has been invited to be a member of that council because they are leaders. They are change makers. So I said to them, I don't think I'm a leader. I really don't see myself as a change maker. I'm a disruptor. I want to question around, well, why are we doing things your way? Have you considered other ways of doing things? And we really come back to the impact and the interface between what is patient-oriented research, what is the healthcare system, what is the willingness to be in that place where we're not comfortable, and where system transformation can happen if we all go there together. And it doesn't matter if you're a disruptor, a leader, or whatever. But what really does matter is what you feel as that person and where you are in your journey through life and maturity and understanding of what patient-oriented research, what matters to you and how do you want to incorporate that into this particular grant or this particular opportunity. And if you don't ask, we won't tell you. So we need to be enabled to do that.
Thanks to all three of you. You've all provided very important perspectives, I think, that sort of round that out. So we've talked a lot about, I guess, the overall state of, I mean, there's lots of different ideas and values and needs and things that have been expressed. So let's just say. So if I was to bring it back to you, Beth, if you were to summarize, I guess, what do you think the perfect patient partnership looks like?
Yeah, I had this discussion with that new researcher who was, just freshly coming into the space and trying to understand it. And I said to him, really, I do want to be invited to all the meetings. And you can give me a bit of an outline of what it's about, and then I'll decide if it makes sense for me to be there or not. I said, think of me as part of the team. So with that example I have where I was sort of getting these one-off, like, oh, can you give us feedback on this? And we need it like yesterday. That's not perfect. Like that just felt very like, so, yeah, I really want to be involved every step of the way. And then with the realization that it may not make sense for me to show up all the time, like but extend the invitation. And then when that actual piece of research is done, I'd still like to be involved or still think of me for that knowledge translation piece. So even with that researcher, we were chatting about, the idea of podcasts and how do we get this information out there. And that could be part of, a piece I could bring and help them with as well. So it's really that whole continuum. And I would just like, if that email goes out to the research team, oh, my name's on it. It's just automatically there. And then I can take it from there. So giving that space and to let me make that decision. And I think if you're dealing with patients who are actively in treatment, which, I'm learning more about and meeting a lot of these people, then you have to also realize that they may not physically be able to attend to everything, and just going to have to be flexible with that.
Yeah, so lots in terms of the equity of it, the inclusion and the empowerment, I guess, to make those choices. So Bev, in terms of, I guess, the current state of patient-oriented research as we certainly have it today, and certainly Brenda has dropped the disruptor bomb in the conversation here, and certainly we use language that's around being a catalyst for change. I mean, from your perspective, who's not at the table that needs to be there?
That's a whole other podcast in itself, I think. Who's not there? I just, want to say, like, yes, I'm part of the queer community. I'm part of the sort of the non-binary, non-gender conforming community. However, having said that, and we've talked about this before, my lens is still incredibly narrow. So while I'm here and I am representative in some way and have the burden of representation for a particular community, I don't represent all of that community, nor do I represent any other communities in that context. But just as we're talking about parallels of healthcare and health systems and parallels in research, is that there are people that are hardly reached communities. I say hardly reached versus sort of leaning into Brenda's lens earlier, and some of the stuff that Brenda was saying is they're not hard to reach. It's hardly reached. When we are thinking of who's not at the table, they are those traditionally underserved, that are hardly reached, that have probably been harmed in many ways in the healthcare system. And when we look at the historical context of research, a lot of those populations have been harmed in research. There were unethical ways of doing research that particular populations had to endure. So those populations often are missing in health research. I mean, Beth just spoke about it as well. People that are in active treatment for their disease or condition or population. Again, all those things need to be considered when we're thinking of patient-oriented research. I mean, there's things that we can do. Typically grant funds, like I look at some convening and collaborating grants, they're 12 months. Well, that's going to take a lot longer to build trusting, safe relationships with a community that's been harmed. It's going to take longer than 12 months. And let's be honest, I think all of us have experienced this. It's probably going to take 3 times as much money. So we need to start considering that at the beginning and the outset of these projects. I encourage funders to consider that, give us 2 or 3 years to create these relationships, and sort of leading into some of the work of like Catherine Milligan, which is around collective impact. It hinges on relationship. Going back to what Brenda was talking about, we can have collective impact as disruptors when we consider this relational practice of patient-oriented research. But there are so many communities that do not show up. I mean, I am hopeful in that we are now seeing, thanks to a lot of the AIDS, HIV movement back in the 80s around research, like actual research itself, that there are methods, I think, where there can be sort of these community-led or initiated research projects that are starting to pop up and that are being well received. But it's intentional. It takes a long time. It takes, again, trauma resiliency informed, and a lot of awareness to reach those communities. But it is up to us that are here, that are representing some of those communities, like myself, that want to continue bringing those voices forward, and as much as I can to encourage and embody, and mentor or bring forward those voices in the best way possible, I think is what our responsibility is at this point.
And if I can just sort of, just turn the table a little bit here as well. I mean, we've obviously talked a lot about, and importantly, right, the value of patient engagement in terms of what it brings to patients and families in terms of being involved in this. From your perspective, what is the value of true patient partnership to those within the health system itself, whether the teams, the people, the researchers, what's in it for them?
I mean, I think it's a number of things. I mean, if we think from a career perspective, let's be honest, they are going to get funded. Like now funding requires patients. I hate to say that because I don't want to see that. It's not like at the hammer and the nail and you have a patient partner and you've got them on your grant and now you're going to get funded. It's not quite as simple as that. There's a lot more involved and we've talked about that. So I think there's a lot of sort of professional advantages to having patient partners within your research. But again, I think it's that relationship. And we talk about like our distressed work environment and people and sustainability in healthcare. And I kind of go back to that compassion piece. We know that when we have compassion satisfaction, we're going to do better work. We're going to do work in well ways. We're going to take care of ourselves, and we're going to contribute much more likely to contribute in healthier ways when we have sort of that compassion satisfaction, that we know we're doing meaningful work. And I think you really can only know that if you're in relationship while you're doing patient-oriented research. It really comes, I know it sounds kind of simple, and it maybe in the world of academic research, it may be seen as a bit foo-foo, kind of talk, non-academic talk, but there's tons of research around mindful self-compassion, compassion for self, compassion satisfaction. And again, I think we need to start talking about that in research. I mean, I'd like to think that my contribution is going to contribute to the betterment of that person that I'm partnering with, that they're going to learn something that maybe they didn't know an hour before talking to me, that then it's going to contribute in their next interaction with someone who is queer and non-binary. I don't know, but that is my hope. And I think that's what people can gain for that. And I think research really for our healthcare system, there's a cost, not savings, but at least we know the research priorities are actually going to be important to the people who are providing and receiving that care. So again, I think that's of huge benefit to the people that are involved.
Yeah, you definitely, I mean, paint a very, a good picture of sort of the virtuous circle that all this sort of leads to, and the interrelatedness of it all. So thank you. Brenda, as we're getting close to the end here, penultimate words to you. What is your call to health organizations and leaders in terms of engaging and partnering with patients?
I would say that our healthcare system is broken. And in the course of being broken, families, individuals, people, communities are broken. And our healthcare system, my call to action really is around understanding the impact of broken and looking at it from the perspective of that we're all people. Our healthcare system is run by people. Our patients are people. We are people. And really, I just would end with this. I want to feel like I belong. I want to feel like I am valued. I want to be accepted as myself, as I am, who I am, for what I am.
Just let that pause and let people sort of absorb that. So thank you, Brenda. So Beth, a final word to you. You know, moving from organizations and the researchers themselves, what is your call to other patients about why to get involved in patient-oriented research?
I think first off, it's a great, like for the patients themselves, and it has been for me, it's a great learning opportunity. So I really thought, having worked in the system for, 20 years, that I kind of knew everything about everything. And then I find every time I come to like meetings or involved in new projects, research projects, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So there is that learning aspect to it. So if you like that sort of tangible learning, I would definitely encourage patients, and not to think they're not smart enough. I think that's another thing. I think sometimes patients are afraid to get involved in research. They're like, well, I don't have a science background, or I never worked in healthcare. That's better, actually, I think. So you don't feel like you have to show up with all this like extensive understanding of like biology and whatever. You don't. I think you're better positioned if you don't have that. So there's that perspective for sure. I would also encourage them, because the work can be very tangible. You can see how things change on the feedback that you give. You can see, there's a whole journey along the way, and I think it's very rewarding to be part of that. It'll open up other doors as well, to maybe even like for yourself. So even like as a breast cancer survivor, I sort of thought like breast cancer treatment was like these 3 things, but then you realize once you get into research, there's so much more than that. So it really gives you a really bigger perspective, but also really learning more about your own disease. If you choose to partner in those type of work, it doesn't necessarily have to be, but if you do, I do feel like it's given me even a better understanding of what I went through, what the options are out there, how it affects people differently. So I find that really interesting, and it really taps into the sort of academic side of me. Like, I like the reading, and I like the giving of the physical feedback and asking questions of curiosity at meetings and things like that. So really just encourage everybody to give it some consideration. It is a very welcoming group of people. I find all the tables that I've sat at and all the work that I've done to this point, 99.9% of the time, people are excited that you're there and appreciative that you're there, and they're learning too. But I have really found it a very hopeful, welcoming space that is only continuing to grow. You will never run out of opportunities to learn and to meet people that want to work with you.
Thank you, Beth. Very uplifting and powerful sort of career fair sort of speech there in terms of why to get involved. So thank you. And honestly, I think as we come to a close of this conversation, and I think as it's been indicated, we could certainly talk about this and so many other parts of this that we haven't been able to explore in the time that we've had here today. but all three of you have been so generous in your time and sharing your experiences. So thank you. Certainly the words that have continued to come up are around learning, engagement, relationships, trust, and I feel sort of very privileged to be part of this conversation with all three of you, to have shared in this, to be able to have learned from you and with you. And I dare say that based on the wisdom, passions that and commitments that you're all bringing to the work that you're doing, I do think that the future for health research in this country is very bright, with all three of you being involved. So thank you again for that.
Thanks, Dale.
Thanks, Dale.
Thank you, Dale.
Thank you. And till next time. You've been listening to the HQ, and I'm Dale Sherbeck, your host. You can find this and other future episodes on the CHA Learning website, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. We'd love to hear what you think, so please follow us on our other social media channels. Thanks for joining us in this discussion today. Please join us next time.